Hey guys, today I'll show you a science fiction thriller TV series named Snowpiercer, Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama is set in the distant future, when war had caused the climate to turn exceptionally hot, leading to the extinction of species and melting of glaciers. Scientists attempted to cool the Earth and reverse global warming, but plunged it into an ice age instead, called the freeze. Before the disaster struck, a scientist named Mr. Wilford had foreseen the freezing future and constructed the Great Arc Train, called the Snowpiercer. This fully enclosed train, capable of perpetual motion, was designed to continually circle the railway around the Earth and mimic the ecological balance of the former world. As the days of the freeze drew to a close, many wealthy individuals bought tickets and took shelter in this Snowpiercer train with its 1,001 carriages. Those who couldn't afford tickets were unwilling to wait for their deaths. Before the train's departure, they launched an invasion. Following a brutal struggle, some of the common folk succeeded in entering the train, only to be pushed back to the very last carriage as the doors to the forward sections closed before their eyes. More than 6 years flashed by. Those commoners from that time still live in the tail section, self-proclaiming as tailenders. In contrast to the brightness and joy of the forward carriages, the tail carriages were dark and cramped. Their survival hinged on the rations regularly distributed by the train's staff. However, the distributed rations kept dwindling, and the staff even enforced sterilization on the tail women, implementing birth restrictions. The tailenders were only given meaningless tasks when needed, treated like workhorses. Such a hopeless life had them thinking of breaking through. 3 years prior, they organized a rebellion, but due to their unfamiliarity with the carriage structure, 62 people were sacrificed, and 13 tailenders had their arms chopped off as punishment. Old Ivan was one of them. He was the only one who had been to the forward carriages. Although he was only taken there to tune a piano, it was the glimpse of light that made the darkness even harder to bear. He was regarded as a sage among the tailenders. Now, with the living conditions in the tail section becoming increasingly harsh, the tailenders are preparing to launch another revolution. Recently, the train guards have become lax, extending the time to open the tail carriage doors to more than 1 minute. If they could break through 4 carriages, they would reach the electrical junction box and cut off the power to the agricultural area. A beardy man named Leighton feels this revolution is too hasty. He hopes for a more long-term development. In fact, the tailenders also have the opportunity to enter the forward carriages, given their knowledge and technical abilities. Although the difficulty is great, Leighton has already exploited this loophole and had 6 spies placed in the forward section. Given enough time, they would be able to gather more information about the forward carriages. A united breakthrough from back to front would make the revolution safer. However, most tailenders can't wait any longer. While they're still young and strong, they might as well give it their all. No matter how good the plan, it cannot go against the will of the people. Leighton has no choice but to agree to act tomorrow. Old Ivan, seeing Leighton's lack of confidence, encourages him. The Snowpiercer could be considered a fortress. It might seem impregnable, but all resistance is never in vain. The tailenders struggle every day for survival, thinking about breaking through and charging forward. Meanwhile, the wealthy in the front carriages lead comfortable lives. Their biggest annoyances each day are trivial matters, like being disturbed while taking a sauna, or not being able to eat noodles in the third-class carriage. The train's chief, Melanie, placates complaining passengers with a smile, dispatching train attendant Ruth to deal with issues in the third-class carriage. It's time to distribute food. The tailenders are prepared, weapons concealed, ready to launch an attack. However, Ruth struts in, directing security personnel to take Leighton away. This sudden action throws everyone off, and the planned attack doesn't proceed. After a series of checks, showers, and sterilizations, Leighton is brought to the third-class carriage dining room. The bright sunlight, magnificent snowy scenery outside the window, and delicious soup and bread before him all make Leighton feel like he's in heaven. He can't wait to start enjoying it. He's then told why he was brought to this section. Before boarding the train, Leighton was a homicide detective at the Detroit Police Department, and he's the only detective on the train now. It turns out that a homicide has occurred in the front carriage. Sean, a third-class passenger working in agriculture, has been killed, and his genitals have been cut off and taken. Such a brutal case could pose a significant danger if left unsolved. Leighton has no interest in dealing with the problems of the front carriage. Even if he solves the case and can stay in the front carriage, he chooses to remain with the tailenders because he doesn't want to be a traitor. But he's beaten up by the security for non-cooperation. Melanie arrives in time and explains the urgency of the case. The same kind of homicide occurred 2 years ago, but someone was already arrested as the culprit and locked in the drawer to serve the sentence. Leighton laughs his messy beard off, saying either someone is imitating the crime or they got the wrong person before. He then takes this opportunity to set his conditions. If they want his help to find the killer, they must give him food and move the tailenders to live in the third-class carriage. Melanie doesn't agree. Instead, she takes him to visit the drawer. The previous perpetrator, Nikki, is serving her sentence here. If Nikki is innocent, then she's serving time unjustly. The drawer is the train's prison, where criminals are forced into a hibernation like sleep. It seems all criminals on the train undergo this punishment, rather than being sentenced to death. Leighton still refuses to investigate the case. Melanie has no choice but to have the train's head brakeman take Leighton to question the suspects, who are Sean's companions. Surprisingly, Sean's lover turns out to be Leighton's wife, Zara. Unable to bear life in the tail 5 years ago, she managed to get a job in the third-class carriage, decisively abandoning all tailenders, including her husband, Leighton. Now, with a murder case happening, Zara has become the prime suspect, facing the prospect of being locked in the drawer to serve her sentence. To survive, she reveals Leighton's detective identity, hoping her husband could save her out. Leighton blames his wife for her selfishness, but Zara also has many grievances. She already wanted to die during the freeze, but Leighton brought her onto the train, only to suffer more. Zara would rather have died outside than suffer in the tail of the train. The head brakeman escorted Leighton to the agricultural area, where 130 carriages were devoted to growing crops. Based on their earlier conversation, Leighton was convinced that Zara was not the culprit. However, the murder case was undoubtedly more complicated than it appeared. Just as Leighton had suspected, Melanie conveyed Mr. Wilford's mindset. Everything on the train was interconnected. A single murder could disrupt the entire ecosystem. The balance and cycle were paramount. If Leighton was interested in this, he should take on the case. Unwavering, Leighton reiterated his demands, now including the reinstatement of reproductive rights for the tailenders. But Melanie asserted that on the train, the status of people and objects should correspond to their value. She would not easily agree to population expansion. In the tail carriage, people sang for old Ivan, celebrating his birthday. They fulfilled his wish to be alone in the crowded carriage for a while, listening to music. Amid the beautiful melodies, everyone enjoyed a rare moment of tranquility. Old Ivan lovingly kissed a photo of his wife. When the music ended, he also ended his life. Leighton's departure and old Ivan's death stirred the tailenders, who resolved to proceed with their plan to push towards the front carriages. They deceived the guards and opened the door to the isolation carriage. As the security entered, they launched their assault. In the ensuing chaos, the big guy broke a guard's arm. Shaking, a young child wearing a hat raised the severed arm to open the door to the next carriage. However, they were met with another wave of fully armed security guards. It was clear they had acted prematurely. The path forward was not as easy to breach as they had hoped. The tailenders were at a disadvantage and took a train attendant hostage. If the rebellion ended, they would face severe punishment. Leighton didn't want his companions to suffer this fate, so he offered to mediate. Melanie agreed, giving Leighton just 3 minutes. He cautiously entered the chaotic carriage strewn with bodies. Despite his companions accusing him of treason, Leighton managed to persuade 3 main rebels to lay down their weapons. Suddenly, he knocked out the captive train attendant to prevent eavesdropping. It turned out that Leighton had not given up on the revolution. After observing the situation all day, he had a plan to break through to the front carriages. He would use the murder investigation as a cover to understand the structure and routines of the front carriages. He would continue to plant informants and launch another rebellion at the right time. For now, he urged the main rebels to surrender and survive by going into hibernation in the drawer, awaiting the day when they could break through to the front. Leighton quelled the rebellion in this way and agreed to investigate the murder on the condition that Melanie not kill the tailenders. Melanie agreed on behalf of Mr. Wilford, but decided to amputate a tailender's hand as a warning to others. At the end of a busy day, Melanie returns to her room. She changes into her MIT sweatshirt and heads to the front of the train. There, a man is sitting in the driver's seat. She slowly approaches the man, who surprisingly stands up to give her his seat. It turns out the mild-mannered Melanie is now playing the role of Mr. Wilford herself. It appears her true identity is kept secret from the passengers. She disguises herself as the train chief for a covert visit, but what could be her other motives? 3 years ago, Nikki, who was wrongly accused of being a murderer, will soon be awakened and released. The wrongful conviction is clearly a ticking time bomb. For safety reasons, Melanie decides to have her watched, but more importantly, once this murder case is solved, another mysterious mission can continue. While persuading Leighton to take on the murder case, Melanie repeatedly mentioned the delicate balance of the train's ecosystem. Therefore, in her view, it was necessary to control the birth rate among the tailenders. However, the tailenders see the violent law enforcement and reduction of food as an infringement on their rights, which forces them to attempt a violent breakthrough. The administrators of the train are considering the overall ecological balance of this fragile man-made kingdom, where every action has a reaction. Sacrifices and controls are necessary. But Melanie, eating sushi and complaining about lacking wood chips to make salmon rolls, raises the question that those in power would likely become self-satisfied dictators. In a different perspective, it seems fair for the wealthy passengers to enjoy a decent life in the train because they had to work hard to afford their rooms and pleasant lives. If this pleasant room will be forcefully occupied by a beggar, the beggar is clearly in the wrong. From this perspective, if the apocalypse comes, it seems even death doesn't treat everyone equally. After Melanie decides to amputate a hand from a tailender as a warning to others, Ruth chooses to execute the child who had opened the door with a severed security guard's hand in the chaos. The child's mother can't bear to see her child suffer and courageously takes her child's punishment. Her right hand is forced outside into the freezing cold, where it becomes frozen and is then shattered with a heavy hammer. At the same time, the 3 main rebels are put into drawers for hibernation. This horror may cause some tailenders to back down, but it also fuels their anger and resentment. As the blizzard intensifies, the high speed of the train has already caused 2 avalanches in the mountains. The engineer suggests slowing down, but Melanie rejects this outright. She is eager to soothe the emotions of the wealthy people in the front carriages. Even though the tailender rebellion is far away, the wealthy are very worried. They feel Mr. Wilford's handling of the situation has been too light-handed. Some even want to interfere in the murder case investigation to demonstrate their influence. But Melanie won't agree and manages to fend them off. On the other side, the train officer, Bess, comes to help Leighton investigate the murder case in the third-class carriage. As Leighton is leaving, he coincidentally sees tailenders being seized for labor. They exchange glances but do not communicate. Leighton and Bess meet the person who discovered Sean's body at a noodle stall. They learn from him that Sean's limbs and genitals had been cut off. Leighton tries to inquire about the checkpoints between carriages, but the alert Bess interrupts him. Given that the suspected murderer Nikki hasn't awakened yet, Leighton decides to go to the night carriage where she used to work to gather information. Unknown to Leighton, Nikki's health is deteriorating. The scientists cannot fully wake her, and her arm is even starting to rot. The night carriage's glamour and decadence are shocking, with a hint of sadness pervading the atmosphere. After the end of the world, it seems people find spiritual respite in the night carriage. Miss Audrey, the songstress, is the manager of the night carriage. She was the one who discovered the first victim. Nikki worked under her. Miss Audrey believes Nikki is innocent, but Mr. Wilford wanted a quick resolution to the case at that time, and poor Nikki became the scapegoat. Leighton's decision to investigate the 2 cases together strikes a chord with Miss Audrey. She is glad that someone can challenge Mr. Wilford and invites Leighton for a drink, forcefully keeping Bess at the door and asking Zara to give a free therapy to Leighton. Although the night carriage is often called a brothel, it also offers therapy for the mental trauma caused by the end of the world. Under Zara's guidance, Leighton enters a meditative state, and they can't help but revive their old intimacy. After their smelly encounter, Zara provides some intelligence to him. The reason Sean's death is taken so seriously is that he was Mr. Wilford's inside man, responsible for gathering information from the carriages and reporting to Mr. Wilford in exchange for benefits, like the permit to have children. Zara chose to get close with Sean, not for love, but for survival in the harsh train at the end of the world, where love is too much of a luxury. Leighton assures Zara that he won't let her be a criminal, but he also won't abandon the tailenders. Next, Leighton and Bess examine Sean's body. The post-mortem discoloration indicates that the killer wanted to torture him, which is why his genitals were cut off. His limbs were severed post-mortem with a butcher's knife, clearly not by the same person. Leighton suspects the train's butcher got involved to increase the beef supply. Bess is still hesitant to believe, thinking that cannibalism is just a rumor among the tailenders. But Leighton shatters her belief. In the early years of the train's operation, a murderous cult did exist. Leighton led a raid on the organization, and after punishing the leader, everyone ate a piece of his heart. In Leighton's view, in a situation of extreme resource scarcity, what's wrong with cannibalism to survive? Bess looks uncomfortable. They arrive at the cattle slaughter area to check the freezer, but can't enter without a witness. Just then, an earthquake hits the mountainous area the train is passing through. A massive amount of snow slides off the slopes and hits the train. The windows of the slaughter area shatter, and in an instant, the people and cattle inside are frozen to death. The scene Leighton and Bess witness is comparable to a hellish tragedy. The train's management sends security personnel to handle the situation, and Leighton and Bess seize the opportunity to check the freezer. Inside the ventilation duct, they find Sean's limb remnants. Unnoticed by Bess, Leighton secretly pockets a piece of wire. The train suffered severe damage. Melanie made her way to the site. The broken windows needed safety checks and repairs, which had to be performed at low speed. So Melanie agreed only to a 12% reduction in speed. To conserve power, she ordered a rolling blackout, starting from the rear of the train. Meanwhile, water supply became tight until the carriage was repaired. Melanie decided to prioritize human needs over crop irrigation. But not all passengers were treated equally. The second and third class cabins had water for 15 minutes each day. The people at the rear of the train were left to fend for themselves. Of course, this strict regimen did not apply to the first class cabins and above. In the slaughter area, both cattle and people died. Melanie sent people to the rear of the train to select apprentices to replace the deceased. Ruth again arrived at the rear of the train with an air of superiority, preaching the virtues of Mr. Wilford, offering education to children, but in reality, she was looking for cheap labor. Even though those selected would never return to the rear of the train, the apprentices would have better food and drink in the front carriages. The parents of the selected children were still very happy. Leighton's friend at the rear, Josie's adopted son Miles, was also selected. Miles's biological mother was killed not long after they boarded the train. He was essentially raised by Josie and Leighton. Miles remembered Leighton's plan to plant spies. Now was the best opportunity to become an informant. He would remember the teachings of his foster mother and Leighton. A temporary separation would not cause them to lose their fighting spirit. He and his foster mother agreed that they would see each other again once the revolution succeeded. Then he resolutely left the rear of the train. Bess reported the case to her superiors, identifying the butcher as the murderer. But Leighton disagreed. He thought the butcher was merely benefiting from the situation, and the real criminal was someone else. The detective's dignity didn't allow him to find a scapegoat. These words moved Bess, and the tension between them decreased. Leighton returned to his room, secretly tore off a piece of his underwear, and drew everything he knew about the carriage on it. He then used a privately stored wire to pry open the metal door, drew recognizable symbols on the ground for the tailenders, and discarded the cloth with information. During the security escort of the rear workers, Leighton caused a commotion, hoping the rear dwellers would get this valuable information. But unfortunately, he failed. Leighton's rebellion brought Melanie's dissatisfaction. She was upset with him for trying to resist Mr. Wilford's order. She thought the tailenders were ungrateful. Leighton spat out a mouthful of blood. Since knowing that Sean was a whistleblower, Leighton understood that Mr. Wilford's so-called balance and maintaining order were nothing more than strict control over the entire train and a declaration of his authority. The importance Mr. Wilford places on Sean's murder case was not for ecological balance, but to find out what secrets Sean had revealed before being killed. Sean's death touched Mr. Wilford's vital interests, so it couldn't be hastily convicted like the first case. Wilford, under the alias Melanie, tightly controlled all matters on the train. Even the rich in the forward cabins, who wanted to meddle in the murder case and expand their influence, were firmly refused by Melanie. On the train, she wanted to be the highest ruler, regardless of the original intention when designing the train. After running for over 7 years, money had lost its value. All material goods had to be exchanged with personal items. Like the chip in Sean's limb was dug out and traded in the first-class cabin, it was just a gambling chip for the rich. In reality, it was a key to open the doors of different class cabins. Eventually, through a series of exchanges, it was handed over by an operator to a guy named Terence in the third-class cabin. Previously, Leighton's attempt to pass a message to the tailenders failed, and he was confined to his room. In his dream, he recalled the day his wife Zara left the rear carriage. While he was upset, he didn't stop her decision and even gave her his wedding ring to use for trading in case she got into trouble. His dream was interrupted when he was hooded and taken to another room. Due to his previous rebellion, Leighton was no longer allowed to freely observe the structure of the train. Melanie warned him not to stir trouble and to focus on solving the murder case. Leighton wanted to talk with Nikki, the murderer of the first case, but found out she was still unconscious. So he shifted his approach and started investigating Sean's surveillance targets, as Sean was an informant. Sean was closely tracking the black market, aiming to find the new hallucinating substance, cronull, that was wreaking havoc in the third-class carriage. For the upper echelons, cronull might be a new thing, but it had already had 2 rounds of popularity in the tail, and the operator had traded it with the tailenders. Immediately, the head brakeman took Leighton to confront people. They intercepted the operator and questioned him about his source of cronull. The operator claimed innocence, stating he had randomly confiscated it from the third-class carriage and didn't know it had anything to do with Sean. But as soon as Leighton and the head brakeman left, he promptly reported the incident to Terence. The investigation duo questioned Zara again, as she was Sean's lover and might have clues about cronull. Zara feigned ignorance because she was busy preparing for the fight night. But when the head brakeman left, she secretly gave Leighton a lead. The drug suppliers were the train's janitors. The so-called fight night was an event where third-class passengers fought each other. The ultimate winner could enter the second-class carriage. The entire fight would be watched by the first-class passengers, using blood and violence to stimulate their numb nerves. Originally, Fight Night wasn't due yet, but with the consecutive murders and a riot in the tail end, Melanie needed this entertainment to distract the first-class passengers, preventing panic and unrest. There were some wealthy people like the lawyer's family who understood the purpose of holding Fight Night early and tried to take advantage of Mr. Wilford's predicament to gain a share of the absolute power. During lunch, Leighton and the head brakeman spent time together, and the atmosphere between them eased. Bess, after getting intimate with Melanie's secretary, Jinju, appeared before them. She heard from Peel that Nikki had actually woken up and immediately took Leighton to record her statement. Meanwhile, Melanie was inspecting the repair work of the damaged carriage, which was not progressing much. Then she received a call from her secretary. Jinju realized she had leaked information and told Melanie that Bess must have gone to find Nikki, so Melanie had to prepare in advance. At this moment, Nikki appeared dazed, her body still feverish. The nurse kept reassuring them that this was a normal phenomenon after a fake death. Leighton checked Nikki's mouth, finding it pitch black, a clear sign of cronull withdrawal. Melanie arrived just in time, quickly noticing something was off with the nurse. It turned out that the nurse had been trading the ingredients for the hallucinating substance with different janitors in exchange for supplies for the hibernators, like ointments to prevent bed sores. The nurse had been meticulously taking care of the bodies, but truly didn't know that these ingredients were being used to produce hallucinating substances. Leighton then saw a strand of Miles's hair in the carriage and feared his adopted son had been put to hibernation, but he was relieved to find out that Miles had become an apprentice. Melanie arranged for them to meet. Now, Miles looked completely different, able to eat well and learn every day. But he hadn't been blinded by the beauty in front of him and always remembered the faith of the tail-end people. Before they parted, Miles hugged Leighton and told him that he would always be watching. Leighton wanted to see his friend Josie, to tell her about her adopted son's situation, but this time Melanie didn't give in, demanding that Leighton first find out who killed Sean. The fight night was about to begin. Leighton decided to go question the janitors. Bess took him to the fight night scene, which was bustling. The wealthy first-class passengers sat on the high second floor, occasionally throwing down precious furs and jewelry as bets, causing chicken screams from the crowd. Below, a group of people in white coats were the janitors led by Terence. Before the fight began, Melanie broadcasted a speech from Mr. Wilford, which everyone listened to quietly. However, they didn't know that it was just a pre-edited audio clip with a voice changer. As the fight began, Leighton slipped away from Bess and found Zara to inquire about Terence, the chief janitor and the person who supplied Sean with cronull. Leighton wanted to talk to Terence by using Zara as his introduction. Zara returned her wedding ring to Leighton. She had never used it for trading because she still loved Leighton. Leighton also still loved Zara, but he couldn't abandon the tail-end people. Zara understood Leighton's choice. After the message was passed, Terence didn't come. Instead, the operator came to refuse the meeting, thus revealing his collusion with the janitors to Leighton. Leighton threatened to cut off the source of cronull to secure a private conversation with Terence. While Leighton was waiting for a response, Nikki slowly regained consciousness and stumbled to the fight night carriage. She was wandering in a daze. A lawyer's family on the second floor surprisingly recognized Nikki. Unlike her parents who thought Nikki was the killer, the lawyer's daughter, LJ, was certain that Nikki was innocent, sharing a glance with the bodyguard behind her. The fight night reached its climax. The spectators below started brawling, turning the scene into utter chaos. The wealthy onlookers only found the spectacle more entertaining. Amid the confusion, Leighton made his way to the third-class carriage to meet Terence, who had been waiting for him. Terence denied killing Sean. His only concern was his drug business. Leighton proposed to divert Mr. Wilford's attention away. No one would bother his business anymore if he could provide information about the murder. So Terence provided a crucial clue. The night Sean was killed, he came to buy cronull, accompanied by an unfamiliar man, possibly from the first-class carriage. Leighton's meeting with Terence wasn't just about the investigation. He took out his wedding ring, hoping to exchange it for something useful that Terence possessed. As fight night concluded, Ruth placated the excited, wealthy spectators. The lawyer's family stayed till the end, relishing the thrill. They didn't forget to suggest to Melanie that they should abandon the tail enders to ensure the supplies for the front car residents. Melanie sidestepped the topic. LJ seemed quite interested in Leighton and his muscles, but he ignored this strange girl. He had a negotiation in mind with Melanie. He would tell her the mysterious man described by Sean before his death in exchange for a chance to see Josie in the tail end. However, unknown to everyone, this same man had already arrived at Nikki's recovery room. He brutally killed the doorman and caretaker, sitting down in front of Nikki. This man was actually the bodyguard standing beside LJ. As the lights went out, Nikki's fate hung in the balance. On the other side, Melanie agreed to Leighton's request, allowing him to meet Josie. Separated by an iron door, Leighton excitedly updated her about Miles's situation, then suddenly expressed his love for her, even kissing her until they were separated by the security personnel. Back in her bed, Josie touched her lips with a smile, seemingly reminiscing the kiss but actually retrieving a small item from her mouth. It's the key chip that could open doors in different class carriages. On the surface, the train appeared orderly, but undercurrents were beginning to surge. The first-class passengers wanted to pressure the authorities into abandoning the tailenders, but it wasn't just the tail end that was contemplating a revolt. Every passenger from the back carriages harbored ambitions to move to the front. Leighton gave the key chip to Josie, adding another layer of protection for their upcoming revolution. Nikki was brutally silenced, her body swiftly discovered. Melanie hurried to the infirmary where the nurse sat on the ground, broken and crying. He had been taking meticulous care of Nikki, who was about to have her name cleared and start anew when she was suddenly killed. Melanie comforted the nurse, instructing him to perform an autopsy on Nikki later. This was important for Nikki herself and for Mr. Wilford. Leighton couldn't believe it. He had provided a detailed description of the first-class carriage murderer, yet they hadn't arrested the killer overnight. Melanie had planned to enter the first-class carriage at dawn, unaware the killer would act so quickly. After the fight last night, the passageways between the different class carriages were completely sealed and hadn't been opened since. This meant the killer was still lurking in the third-class carriage. Melanie organized a security team to start searching from the tail, asking Ruth to wake the sleeping first-class passengers. Later, she would take Leighton to the first-class carriage for questioning. Nikki's death hit the night carriage manager, Miss Audrey. She worried that if the killer was indeed a first-class passenger, Nikki's death would never be avenged. People in third class seemed to live more comfortably than those in the tail, yet they too lived under the oppression of first class. So far, all victims were from third class, and Nikki's death might become the spark igniting their rebellion. Leighton wanted to extract information from Miss Audrey, hoping the tailenders could ally with third class. However, Miss Audrey didn't give a direct response, instead advising Leighton to be careful. Upon entering the first-class carriage, Leighton scoffed at the expensive art hung in the corridors. The elite of the first class caused the end of the world, yet the common people bore all the suffering while they lived in peace, enjoying all kinds of luxuries. Melanie, a bit annoyed, came from poverty and struggled to her current position. She didn't need Leighton to lecture her on the cruelty of class privilege. Instead, they should focus on extracting information from the first-class passengers and catching the killer. She promised to bring justice to the victims. Being woken up before dawn, the first-class passengers were very displeased. With arrogance, they claimed that people in first class were superior and would never stoop to murder. Leighton saw through their false bravado. They relied solely on their social status, which was quickly diminished when Mr. Wilford demanded a thorough search of the first-class carriage. LJ was cooperative, revealing that her bodyguard didn't return to the first-class carriage the previous night and had left the fight early, carrying a gun. Melanie immediately suspected the bodyguard. While carrying firearms on the train was prohibited, this rule was disregarded by the elite, their bodyguards each armed with a gun. This was their privilege. Leighton demanded to search the bodyguard's room, but the lawyer mother objected, insisting on speaking with Mr. Wilford and prohibiting tailenders from entering. Melanie indulged her, making a pretend call to Mr. Wilford with the engineer on the other end playing along. Leighton carefully observed Melanie's expressions, seeming to see through something. When Melanie offered the phone to the lawyer mother to speak with Mr. Wilford, the usually haughty woman backed down. Despite flaunting her power and prestige, when faced with the highest authority on the train, she lacked confidence. In the bodyguard's room, Leighton found a hook, which could be the murder weapon. The lawyer couple claimed not to recognize it, but their daughter LJ seemed familiar with it. Because of this, Leighton decided to question the family separately. The lawyer couple told Melanie that they had hired the bodyguard at the start of the freeze. Before boarding the train, a riot had broken out, and someone attempted to kidnap their young daughter. The bodyguard saved her at the risk of his own life. This traumatic event had a significant impact on LJ, so her parents indulged her every whim ever since. They even turned a blind eye to the abnormal relationship between her and the bodyguard. Being familiar with the bodyguard, LJ knew all about his tough exterior and soft heart. She even knew about the sweet little cat he cared for, and that he enjoyed gentle melodies on vinyl. As she elegantly danced to the music, Leighton formulated a theory. Typically, castration is a crime of passion and not commonly committed by male perpetrators. It's almost exclusively the domain of female killers. So the bodyguard was likely just a tool, and he might just help deal with the bodies. The real mastermind was the seemingly innocent girl before him. Once Leighton confronted her, LJ didn't panic because she knew the bodyguard would never betray her. He would even sacrifice himself for her. Now the only person who knew the truth was Leighton, and she promised to provide him with a gun for the tailenders in exchange for his silence. As LJ predicted, the bodyguard was cornered in the third-class carriage by the security team. He took the secretary Jinju hostage, but let her go at the last minute. He also discarded his only weapon, allowing the security team to kill him, sacrificing his life for his love. Upon hearing the news of the bodyguard's death, LJ pretended to be devastated. Her parents comforted her, offering support. Only Leighton remained indifferent, signaling Melanie to observe LJ's expression. Hidden under her mother's shoulder, the crying girl revealed a satisfied smile. Understanding Leighton's hint, Melanie called for the security. Against the detective's conscience, Leighton didn't agree to LJ's promise but revealed her actions. Enraged and embarrassed, LJ attacked Leighton like a wild chicken before being subdued. After the investigation, Melanie announced to the entire train that the order had been restored. Watching Melanie's calm demeanor, Leighton confirmed his suspicion that she was indeed Mr. Wilford. Melanie invited Leighton for a drink of sake, but he insisted on returning to the tail end of the train, pointing out that the mysterious Mr. Wilford was merely an authority figure created by Melanie. He collapsed shortly after, having been drugged by the wine he drank. The tailenders used the chip key provided by Leighton previously to connect with their informant, a dining car attendant, stationed in the third-class carriage. They hoped she could help contact Leighton to discuss their next steps. However, not long after, she delivered the news that Leighton had disappeared. Melanie admired Leighton's intelligence, but she dared not send him back to the tail. Instead, she kept him sleeping in a drawer, forever a silent keeper of secrets. Ever since LJ was locked up, she still attempted to flirt with the head brakeman. But when her parents arrived, she switched to a pitiful persona. Today, she would stand trial for murder. The court, composed of first- and second-class carriage members, would make the decision. Her mother thought it was merely the death of some third-class folk and tried to put pressure on Melanie. Observing the girl's feigned tears, Melanie asserted that everything was being done by the book. Clearly, she was also inclined to punish LJ. The head brakeman was skeptical about the trial, thinking that LJ might be let off lightly, which could incite rebellion in the third-class carriage. The lawyer couple had the same idea, smugly assuming their daughter would be exonerated. They believed their daughter's life was far more valuable than those of the third class. Predicting this injustice, Miss Audrey sent a gift to the first-class carriage, some rotting food crawling with cockroaches. Melanie understood this as a warning. Miss Audrey demanded that the third-class carriage also have the right to participate in the trial. She proposed that each class selects a representative to form a jury, and agreed to send a delegation from the third class to observe the trial. The autopsy report for Nikki came out. The drawer hibernation had caused irreversible damage to her body, and the psychological damage was incalculable. The drawer's penal function was not as perfect as it claimed. Under mounting pressure, Melanie agreed to Miss Audrey's demands. As individual jury members were drawn from each class, the people of the third-class carriage cheered. Even though this action was Mr. Wilford's acquiescence to public opinion, Ruth didn't approve of this compromise. She understood the essence of the train's normal operation, saying that they have no will, only order and command. This statement seemed both prophetic and a warning. The inclusion of the third class in the trial made the lawyer couple nervous. They knew this would greatly impact their daughter's trial. So they joined forces with some elites and tried to turn the security chief without challenging Mr. Wilford's authority, demanding control over the train's daily power. They intended to get rid of Melanie as a warning to others. The security chief looked on coldly at the group, providing no clear response. However, the details of this attempted coup had already been reported to Melanie. The trial of LJ was about to begin. First, the prosecution brought forth witnesses and evidence. The genitals of the deceased men were found in LJ's room. It was confirmed that these items were severed while the men were still alive. At the revelation, all the men in the room felt a pang of sympathy. The most crucial testimony came from Miss Audrey. She was there to seek justice for Nikki. To the train's elites, Nikki was just a minor character whose death was insignificant. But she represented the countless masses from the third-class carriage. It was their tireless work that allowed the privileged to enjoy daily conveniences. In return, they received cold carriages and poor medical care. The people of the third-class carriage understood that survival in this ice age was already challenging enough. So initially, they agreed to give up their dignity and abide by Mr. Wilford's class tyranny to stay alive. But after 7 years, Miss Audrey had seen the true colors of the elites. Everyone needed to save their souls. Miss Audrey's impassioned speech received a round of applause. It seemed that the trial might have a just outcome. During the trial recess, Melanie intercepted LJ's mother, urging them to abandon their rebellious plans. The mother refused to back down. Her daughter had blinded her father at the age of 7. The lawyer father's first response was to coddle his capricious daughter. Even till now, he would even let her play with his fake eye, just to make her happy. Such a twisted love meant that they would never let their daughter be convicted. When it was LJ's turn to speak, she portrayed herself as pitiful. Crying, she shifted all the blame onto the bodyguard, portraying herself as an ignorant and manipulated girl. This was all scripted by her lawyer parents. But soon, the girl revealed her sinister nature by revealing secrets known only to her. Sean was a snitch, and this train held 400 secrets. The crowd was confused by her words, but it didn't matter. All she needed was for Melanie to grasp the underlying meaning. Melanie had to consider carefully. There were a total of 400 drawer cells on the train. The prison cabin was actually being used for a certain experiment. It seemed that Sean couldn't bear the torment before his death and had let slip a significant secret. Now, this became LJ's trump card for turning the tables. After deliberating, Melanie relayed her decision to the front of the train. Soon, the trial verdict was announced. The jury unanimously declared LJ guilty of murder. The representatives from the third-class carriage couldn't help but cheer. However, their joy was short-lived. A note from Mr. Wilford arrived, stating his own verdict. Due to LJ's young age, she was exempt from all punishment. The representatives were furious. Members of the first and second-class carriages left under the escort of security personnel. On behalf of Mr. Wilford, Melanie warned LJ to keep the secret of the drawer cells. LJ agreed with delight. However, she also kept the other secrets that Sean had revealed before his death as a shield, leaving triumphantly. While everyone's attention was focused on the trial, Josie seized the opportunity to work in the third-class carriage, swapping identities with the dining car attendant. The tail-end passengers surmised that Leighton was being held in the prison carriage, so Josie sought the help of Terence, the head of the janitors, to sneak into the prison carriage. However, Terence was there to steal the raw materials of cronull. After getting what he wanted, he left Josie to her own devices. Josie started opening the drawers and unexpectedly found many familiar faces from the tail end. Eventually, she located Leighton, but was discovered by Bess and the operator. Bess, having previously assisted in the investigation, was equally surprised to find Leighton here because she had been told that he had returned to the tail end. She knocked out the operator to help Josie rescue Leighton and directed her to seek Zara's help. Josie handed a groggy Leighton over to Zara and returned to switch back with the attendant. While unconscious, Leighton was haunted by dreams of the time they had to resort to cannibalism, reliving the scene of sharing a human heart with his comrades. Amidst the pain and struggle, he finally woke up. Interactions between Melanie and Miss Audrey hinted that Melanie used to be a subordinate of Mr. Wilford, sharing the same dream as Miss Audrey, to provide peace for everyone on the train. But now Melanie had become Mr. Wilford. What exactly had happened during this period? Here, it's worth introducing the class distribution on the Snowpiercer. Mr. Wilford resided at the front of the train. Apart from 2 engineers and Melanie, no one else could enter. The passengers in the first and second class carriages were all wealthy or nobility. They bought their tickets and didn't need to work. The third class carriage was filled with passengers who were allowed to ride for free on the condition that they worked to maintain the train's operation. The tail end was occupied by those who had stormed the train at the beginning. The trial of LJ had ended, but the outcome was far from satisfactory. The undercurrents in the third-class carriage began to stir, seeking justice for Nikki. Handbills calling for a strike were distributed to everyone in the third-class carriage. This was going beyond Melanie's control, and she had to thwart their strike plan. She then stormed into the third-class carriage with her security team and announced that if they really carried out their strike, it would be a misuse of their free tickets. As a repercussion, she would select 10 strikers to be dispatched to the tail end, replacing them with 10 people from there. Leighton was hiding in Zara's room, vomiting a black substance since he woke up. His mood was volatile, and he started to lash out for no apparent reason. Josie came again to move him, fearing that there might be an accident. Leighton revealed to Josie that Melanie was indeed the one in control of the train. He instructed her to keep this secret until she figured out how to use it to their advantage. Josie coordinated with their allies in the third-class carriage to deliver Leighton to the science doctor for treatment. The same doctor had previously performed the autopsy on Nikki. By now, Leighton was hostile towards anyone not from the tail end, acting out in an irrational frenzy. The doctor, however, didn't mind. He diagnosed it as a side effect of being awakened from the drawer. He was willing to help, and naturally, he had his reasons too. There were 400 drawers in the second-class carriage, acting as cells for mass imprisonment, human experimentation, and unlawful detention. The doctor had access to the files of all passengers on the train. In every 10 files, there would be one marked with a red cross, rumored to be enemies of the train. Both Leighton's and Josie's files carried this symbol. Recently, the doctor discovered his name had been added to the blacklist, which prompted him to offer help in the hopes of finding a way to survive. Melanie's threat shook the determination of some potential strikers, including Zara. Already pregnant, Zara didn't want her child to be born in the grim tail end. She was also worried that Miss Audrey, as the instigator of the strike, would be thrown to the tail end. Miss Audrey, however, was not afraid. As a leader, she was committed to fighting for the rights of the third-class passengers. Just then, a mechanical failure occurred in the 780th carriage of the train. The wires were corroded and short-circuited, causing a brake failure. The motor couldn't stand the friction temperature, making the situation critical. Melanie instructed the repair team to replace the motor while assuring the passengers over the radio. She personally supervised the situation. Leighton, upon hearing Melanie's voice, couldn't control his rage. He snatched the key chip from Josie's wrist, intending to confront Melanie with a knife. Luck was on his side as he quickly found Melanie, who was overseeing the repair work. However, the train began to shake in the motor replacement operation. It seemed on the verge of breaking apart at any moment. The train system detected a malfunction and automatically issued a warning. One moment, everyone was safe. The next, they were all in mortal danger, awaiting their fate at this critical juncture for human survival. In the tail-end carriage, the mother took her child's place and suffered her shattered arm. Despite this sacrifice, she didn't make it. The people in the tail end were shrouded in grief and despair. To lift their spirits, they projected the outside world onto a white cloth through a hole. This was the first time in 7 years they could see the world outside again. The child, who had never seen the outside, was mesmerized. Even just the expanse of white snow gave them hope and light. Melanie was in a hurry to fix the train. Confronted by an enraged Leighton, she explained that the train's ecosystem was delicate and could easily be thrown off balance. The passengers were all carefully selected as potential survivors in the event of human extinction. Leighton was skeptical about Melanie's explanation, but prioritized the train's safety and temporarily abandoned his assassination attempt. As soon as Melanie arrived at carriage 780, the engineer pointed out that the main hydraulic device had malfunctioned due to the recent accident. Without hesitation, Melanie took it upon herself to fix it. They didn't have much time. If they didn't repair the hydraulic connection in a few minutes, a large section of the train would derail. After several failed attempts, Melanie managed to secure the detached pipe back onto the hydraulic system. The device returned to normal, and the carriage stopped shaking. Everyone's lives were saved. This incident also saved Melanie's rule. After surviving this near-death experience, the third-class passengers forgot about their planned strike, indulging in the joy of survival and celebrating everywhere. However, Miss Audrey had a different view. She said the celebrations would end, but their dissatisfaction wouldn't. Next time, there wouldn't be a disaster to save them. After calming down, Leighton returned to Josie's side. The doctor arranged for them to hide in his restroom. With only the warm lights left in the room, they found themselves in a passionate embrace, but without a kiss. Unlike those basking in the joy of survival, Melanie quickly composed herself. The mechanical failures of the train were bound to increase over time, necessitating the training of a new generation of engineers. Her choice for this was Miles. Apart from Miles's genuine talent, his identity also played a part. Melanie announced to the entire train that Miles had been chosen as an engineering apprentice and had been granted the privilege to go to the front of the train. This caught the attention of Leighton and Josie. Josie originally planned to return to the tail end, but now she wanted to see her adopted son. Leighton, however, was taken away by his allies from the night carriage. During his class, Miles suddenly started vomiting and was rushed to the doctor for treatment. Josie, disguised as a nurse, had a moment with Miles under the cover of the doctor and his teacher. Even though he was chosen to be in the front carriage, Miles hadn't forgotten the hopes of the tail-end people. He assured his adoptive mother Josie that he was always ready to make contributions to the tail end from the front of the train. At the same time, Leighton was rallying the leaders of various trades in the third-class carriage and the night carriage. He hoped they could join forces with the people in the tail end to launch a revolution. To gain their trust, Leighton willingly played his trump card. Not only did he have a key chip that could pass through all carriages, but he also knew the secrets of the front of the train. Melanie realized that Leighton was always a threat as long as he was free. Through the missing sedative ingredients in the drawer cabins, she deduced that Leighton's escape had something to do with Terence, the head janitor. Terence admitted to meeting Leighton, but only gave information about Sean's murder, concealing the secret of the key chip. He assured Melanie that he would inform her the moment Leighton approached him again. Next, Melanie approached Zara. Pregnancy and childbirth on the train were privileges. Since Melanie had granted Zara the right to become pregnant, she could also kill the child in her womb if Zara didn't cooperate. To protect her hard-won baby, Zara compromised and revealed that it was Josie who had rescued Leighton. So Melanie came to the tail end and took Josie, who had just returned. Ordinarily, interrogation would be carried out by security officers or brake operators, but Melanie chose to do it herself. She let in the cold air from outside the carriage, freezing Josie's right pinky finger, and pressured her to disclose Leighton's whereabouts. Josie remained silent. Melanie shattered her frozen pinky with a hammer. This was the first time Melanie had done something so cruel herself. Unable to bear it, she rushed to the bathroom to vomit. During that time, Bess entered the interrogation room. She had previously aided Josie in rescuing Leighton and couldn't bear to watch Josie suffer now. Josie knew she was a good person. Therefore, Josie asked her to go to the night carriage after this and inform Leighton that Zara was a traitor and Miles was ready for the revolution at any moment. Before Bess left, Josie asked her to do one more thing. After composing herself, Melanie returned to the interrogation room. Ruth appeared anxiously, seemingly with important information to share. Not long ago, the security chief and the lawyer couple had found her, telling her that they were planning to get rid of Melanie and wanted Ruth to replace her as Mr. Wilford's messenger. However, Ruth greatly admired Mr. Wilford, the man who had granted her this job on the train. Hence, she was not persuaded. She believed that Mr. Wilford's choice of Melanie was correct. Ruth wanted to inform Melanie of a mutiny. However, Melanie, agitated by her first interrogation, didn't want to hear anything and rudely dismissed Ruth, dousing her enthusiasm. Melanie walked into the interrogation room only to find Josie's handcuffed hands frozen. Desperate, Josie shattered her own frozen hand, broke free from the handcuffs, and tried to kill Melanie. The guards at the entrance had been distracted by Bess, oblivious to the commotion inside. In the chaos, Melanie got the upper hand. She opened the freeze tube, escaped, and quickly closed the door. Josie was thus left to freeze to death in the interrogation room. The taste of murder was not pleasant. All Melanie could do was to send Miles to the front of the carriage, perhaps a small compensation for the dead Josie. Miles perceived Melanie's lack of enthusiasm and asked her if being an engineer could make her happy. Melanie replied that the mission she carried for the train was more important than her own happiness. For the normal operation of the Snowpiercer, she could give up everything, even her morals. Terence was later brought into the night carriage. He shared Melanie's movements with Leighton and Audrey. He stated that he wouldn't betray Leighton, but neither would he assist the Tailenders in their revolution, because in his view, Leighton stood no chance of winning. Bess found Leighton and relayed the message Josie had asked her to pass on, and informed him of Josie's death. Leighton, filled with pain, retreated to the night carriage to mourn. Melanie's actions deeply stirred his hatred. Only by killing this woman could his anger be quelled. For the success of the Tailenders' revolution, and to ensure Josie's sacrifice was not in vain, Leighton sought the assistance of LJ from the first-class section. From the previous episodes, we can now deduce that the creator of Snowpiercer, Mr. Wilford, has died. After his death, Melanie took over Snowpiercer, bearing the responsibility of maintaining the train's normal operation and taking on the role of leader. However, she also concealed the news of Mr. Wilford's death. Leighton saw through this and gathered all forces trying to fight their way to the front of the train. His slogan is for equal rights, but it seems more like he wants the Tailenders and the third-class passengers to become the rulers of the train. Meanwhile, the lawyer couple and the security chief are also unwilling to comply. They are plotting to seize more power. Snowpiercer is like a pyramid. The people at the bottom want to climb up, while the upper class are not satisfied with their current lives and want to gain more benefits and privileges. Leighton, in order to increase the odds of a successful revolution, chose to ally with the haughty girl, LJ. He decided to take her to see the biggest secret hidden at the front of the train firsthand. The person who could help accomplish this was naturally Miles, who was already living at the front of the train. Taking advantage of Melanie and the engineer's absence, Miles opened the door to the front car, welcoming the eager LJ. She excitedly observed the front car, even approaching the spectacled engineer who was engrossed in his music. The engineer didn't notice her, even as she got close to him. Learning that Mr. Wilford was not on the train, LJ could hardly contain her excitement, gleefully saying that Melanie was in big trouble. After observing information beneficial to her, LJ tore off a photo of Melanie and her daughter as evidence, leaving the front of the train smugly, as if foreseeing Melanie's tragic future. The leaders of key carriages such as the Tail, Communication, Third Class, and Night Car gathered in secret, listening to Leighton's plans and steps for the rebellion. LJ passed on information about the front of the train. Everyone began to take action. Bess sided with Leighton, and her girlfriend Jinju was even more fearful of Melanie. To ensure Jinju's safety, Bess insisted she stay in the room and not go out to avoid accidental harm. The previous attempt by the lawyer's family and the security chief to persuade Ruth to defect failed simply because Ruth is a fervent follower of Mr. Wilford. She only obeys Mr. Wilford's orders. Now, knowing that Mr. Wilford was not on the train, Ruth was somewhat incredulous. But eventually, she complied with the lawyer's instructions to convene a first-class car committee and summoned Melanie from the front of the train. The biggest secret was exposed. Melanie tried to scare off the suspicious LJ with the old trick of pretending to communicate with Mr. Wilford. However, this trick no longer worked. LJ directly produced the photo of Melanie and her daughter as proof that she had been to the front of the train. Soon, Melanie was detained by the security chief's men. Whether it is revolution or rebellion, the most important thing is the armed force. Not every passenger in the first-class carriage will obey the lawyer couple's instructions. The security chief directly issued a notice, and almost all security officers rushed from various cars to the first-class car to participate in this rebellion by the wealthy. The security chief then took Ruth to the front of the train, wanting her to see the truth with her own eyes. Melanie was escorted to the interrogation room. In the guise of searching for something, she stealthily sent a lockdown warning to the engineers in the head car. The security officers had already started to break down the door. The spectacled engineer, in a state of panic, surrendered without hesitation. His lack of backbone angered the other engineers, who pushed him out and locked the cockpit door themselves, not giving the security chief and his men a chance to enter. Ruth also confirmed from the spectacled engineer that Mr. Wilford was not on the train. From the start to the end, it was Melanie who controlled the train. The chaos in the first-class car gave the tailenders an opportunity. Red ribbons were hung all over the car, signaling that it was time to ignite the rebellion. Some of the tailenders and third-class people took action at key points. Bess, under the pretense of escorting Leighton, knocked out the tail-end car guard and successfully opened the locked door. Leighton rallied everyone, telling them that today they were going to seize the entire train for all the dead tailenders and make the front-end people realize that the train should serve everyone. The third-class people, along with the tailenders, destroyed the train's communication system, preventing information from being disseminated. The operator noticed something was amiss and escorted them to meet up with the head brakeman. Miss Audrey sent a skilled tailender to the drawer car to work with the nurse and awaken the hibernating tailenders. The news of the tail-end car's uprising was reported to the first-class car. The security chief realized that the simultaneous rebellions were not a coincidence. There must be a mole, but there was no time to investigate that now. Suppressing the tail-enders was a top priority. The chaos in the train did not disturb Melanie. In the interrogation room, she was confronted by Ruth, whose faith had collapsed. Ruth was a steward personally hired by Mr. Wilford. She sincerely admired Mr. Wilford, revered him for building the train, for setting up the rules and order for the end of the world, and for giving people hope to live on. But now, Melanie claimed that she designed the train and established the system. Mr. Wilford, from the start, didn't believe that the Snowpiercer could operate normally. He was just a capitalist who collected tickets, just thinking about making enough money to enjoy himself. So before boarding the train, Melanie sent Mr. Wilford to meet Jesus in heaven, setting him free from sufferings in the apocalypse. Ruth refused to listen. She fiercely accused Melanie of being a liar and a murderer. Now, she decided to stand with the lawyer's family, execute Melanie tomorrow, and restore order to the train. The brakemen gathered in the third-class carriage, with Leighton and Bess acting as the vanguard, trying to persuade the brakemen not to resist. The head brakeman and Leighton had worked together before. Their relationship was not contentious. After Leighton promised not to harm the people in the third-class carriage, the head brakeman gave way to the revolution of the tailenders. However, the security team was not so easy to deal with. A bloody battle began. Countless security officers and tailenders were killed or injured. The security chief couldn't hold on any longer and ordered his men to retreat with him. It seemed like the tailenders had won, but the bodies strewn across the floor and the blood smeared everywhere hinted that this was not the end. The security officers, in order to prevent the tailenders from advancing, tossed tear gas into the train car. Leighton could only lead his people to retreat temporarily and prepare for the next move. Meanwhile, the skilled tailender and the nurse were hiding in the prison carriage, continuing to awaken others. They discovered that one of their companions, Pike, was missing. It turned out that the lawyer's family had already woken Pike up earlier. They wanted to extract Leighton's weaknesses from him. Pike was originally a radical member of the Tailenders' revolution, but he didn't fight for the Tailenders. He just wanted to enjoy the luxurious treatment in the first-class carriage. So now, Pike didn't hesitate to betray Leighton, saying that Leighton couldn't accept failure after taking a big risk. Once subjected to this kind of mental torment, Leighton would break down. Many tailenders who participated in the riot were arrested by the security team. Melanie and they were locked up together, facing execution by inhaling the cold air outside the train, which would freeze their lungs and cause death. The battle lines between the front and rear carriages were at a stalemate. Both sides had their own considerations. On Leighton's side, Bess thought they should press their advantage and strike while the iron was hot. Miss Audrey, however, believed they should strengthen their defenses and hold on to their current gains. Zara wanted to talk to Leighton about something, but because of Josie's death, Leighton chose to ignore her. The security chief wanted to break through the control of the front and release poison gas through all the doors. Once the gas was released, almost everyone in the rear carriages would die. The lawyer's family agreed with this proposal. They weren't afraid of harming civilians. After all, suppressing the rebellion was the priority. The spectacle of their cruelty terrified the bespectacled engineer. However, there was a chance for a turn of events. The wealthy sent Pike to negotiate. If Leighton surrendered and accepted execution, and the tailenders and third-class people retreated, they would abandon the poison gas strategy. They gave Leighton an hour to consider. Bess did not agree with surrendering. To them, to give up halfway through the rebellion would be to throw away all they had achieved. Miss Audrey also didn't agree, but she hoped that before Leighton made a decision, he would talk to Zara. After all, whether to surrender or fight, Leighton was in danger of making a sacrifice. Reluctantly, Leighton went to find Zara. This was the woman who had caused Josie's death. But Zara had compelling reasons. She was pregnant with Leighton's child. As a mother, she had to protect her child. This news shocked Leighton. He had never thought he could have a child. If they continued to resist, the child could die from the poison gas. If they stopped resisting, Zara and the child could survive. Leighton made a decision. He was willing to surrender in exchange for the lives of the child and other revolution participants. He then sent Pike back to report. Meanwhile, Melanie was dragged into the execution chamber facing imminent death. Unexpectedly, the executioner and the bespectacled engineer conspired to save her and sent her to join Jinju. There were now two forces on the train, the lawyer couple and the security chief in the front and the rebels in the tail. Jinju wanted to take Melanie to the front of the train to seek support from the wealthy, who were opposed to the lawyer couple. Melanie told her secretary to hide and save herself. She decided to join Leighton's side. Using her familiarity with the train, Melanie quickly reached the rear carriages and linked up with Leighton. At the same time, Ruth was rummaging through Melanie's room, which was filled with recordings, diaries, and tools belonging to Mr. Wilford. It was a paradise for a fervent fan like Ruth. The security chief took this opportunity to persuade Ruth. One of them had an armed team, and the other had prestige among the crew. They could bypass the lawyer couple and become the controllers of the train. Pike brought back the news of Leighton's surrender. The security chief collaborated with Ruth to arrange the surrender scene. LJ persuaded her parents to join in so that all the wealthy people would know who the real ruler of the train was. The lawyer couple agreed with great satisfaction. Melanie always claimed to prioritize the overall situation. She finally persuaded Leighton to pretend to surrender in order to gather the security team in one carriage. Not far from the track, there was a fork. She would contact the head engineer to operate it and go with Leighton to the separation point to manually disarm the safety device. At a precise location, they would disconnect that carriage, effectively discarding the new rulers. Bess and Miss Audrey believed that even if the plan was feasible, it was just helping Melanie seize power. Melanie didn't hesitate to give up control. She promised to hand over the train to Leighton. If she hadn't been able to control the train with a strict hierarchical system, she now wanted to see how Leighton would manage it after ascending to the peak of power. The engineer found the video of Miles's betrayal. Miles thought he was freeing the tailenders, who were living in poverty, lacking clothing, food, and human rights. This was necessary. But the engineer mocked him for being too naive. The resources on the train were said to be unlimited, able to provide for everyone, but the machine ensuring resource recycling had a lifespan. He said that one day they would die due to the lack of a single nut. In the head carriage, there was a short-range communicator that only Melanie and the engineer knew how to use. Melanie used it to contact the engineer and informed him of the plan she had agreed upon with Leighton. It needed the engineer and Miles to cooperate at the precise time to disconnect the safety device of the carriage. One near the rear carriages could be opened by Melanie, and the other had to be accessed from behind the surrender ceremony carriage. It would be impossible for Leighton to do it alone. So Bess persuaded the head brakeman to help, pretending to escort Leighton to surrender. In the wealthy carriages, there was a hubbub of people as if the rebellion had ended. But some were uneasy about this extravagance and didn't want to be led by the lawyer couple. They secretly supported the tailenders and provided them with a gun. Melanie extracted the chip from her body and handed the key to Leighton. It could open all checkpoints on the train. This operation had to be precise. If an accident occurred resulting in a disconnection that couldn't be reconnected, then the people in the rear carriages with food would freeze to death, and the people in the front carriages with the heating system would starve. Before the operation, the three synchronized their times. When Melanie disarmed the safety device on this side, Leighton only had 3 minutes left. The head brakeman escorted Leighton to the site of surrender, where the lawyer couple staged a ceremonial show. After signing the surrender document, the security chief took him to carry out the execution. The security team members assaulted and insulted Leighton. Seizing the opportunity, the head brakeman found the hidden pistol and threatened the security chief to release Leighton. Both Leighton and the head brakeman challenged the crowd, and just when they were about to collapse, the skilled tailender arrived with his comrades to provide support. The comrades managed to get the upper hand. The security members were quickly subdued. Leighton instructed his comrades to treat the injured head brakeman, who made his way to the separation point to disable the security device. But when he was about to press the release button, he found that many of the tail enders who had been caught were still locked in the carriage to be separated. Leighton hesitated. He could not face the sacrifice, which was his weakness. He tried to rescue these people, but time did not allow him to stay any longer. With the countdown reaching its final second, Leighton pressed the security device. For the victory of the revolution, he had to give up on the comrades with whom he had once lived and fought side by side. The carriage carrying the security team, the lawyer couple, and his tail-end companions was quickly disconnected. The engineer and Miles controlled the speed of the train to reconnect the rear and front carriages. Melanie watched Leighton indifferently. She knew early on that it was necessary to give up on those captured tail-enders, and she gave the choice to Leighton. This was perhaps Melanie's first lesson to Leighton that success in revolution will inevitably require sacrifices. The head brakeman had initially paved the way for the tail-enders revolution, but he did not participate. He was merely an observer, watching as some tail-end revolutionaries during the truce frenziedly seized reserved food, provoking others at every turn. What the head brakeman saw was chaos, disorder, and greed. For this revolution, the order on the train had completely vanished. Halfway through, Melanie arrived at the agricultural carriage, where she saw crops that had withered because no one had cared for them. According to her initial concept of balance, restoring these food sources would be a big problem. Leighton was a person filled with idealism. Melanie might have once been as passionate as him, having beautiful fantasies about managing the train well, but she hadn't been able to realize this on the train in the past 7 years. Leighton shouted the slogan for equal rights for all, but his first step to success was to give up on the tail-enders who were as revolutionary as him and who had been captured. With Melanie cutting off part of the train, the front carriage usurpers were exiled. Leighton's side claimed the victory of the revolution. Through a broadcast, Melanie officially handed over the leadership to Leighton. Meanwhile, the Snowpiercer is about to complete a global round, passing their original starting point, Chicago, a new regime with a new start. This will be a day like no other. However, the train did not regain peace after the rebellion. The tail-enders became free. Several of them indulged in robbery and looting, especially the Revolutionary Army, who harbored great hostility towards the people at the front of the train. They didn't even think their behavior was problematic. People gathered in the front carriage, pulling Leighton into protest. Leighton assured everyone that everything was under control, and the people in the front carriage did not have to worry about retaliatory robberies. Everyone must return to work as soon as possible and let the Snowpiercer resume normal operation. Leighton announced the establishment of a democratic parliament and government. Until the order is officially restored, everyone present today is the department head and train representative. Leighton's impassioned speech temporarily quelled most of the protests from those who had gained power. The train will reach Chicago tonight, a moment worth commemorating. Obviously, Leighton's idealism did not completely win over everyone. For example, there was a significant problem with the train's food supply chain. The experienced hands were all killed, and the tail-enders had carried out a wave of looting. Jinju, responsible for managing the food supply chain, was very worried about whether the ecological balance could be restored to previous levels. She was skeptical of Leighton's so-called democratic management. Such factional differences also meant that Jinju and Bess could not continue. The two kissed goodbye and officially broke up. Then there's Ruth, who still felt the need for the train to be constrained by rules. As an attendant personally selected by Mr. Wilford, Ruth still adhered to her formal attire and job, but she couldn't agree with Melanie and Leighton's methods, and officially drew a line with Melanie. Compared to the few survivors accustomed to the original system, most people who suddenly gained power were more keen to exploit loopholes. Now the access controls of the front and rear carriages of the train have become nominal, and theft incidents have been ongoing. Many tail-enders steal things from the first-class cabin and resell them at high prices. The train's prison is even full to bursting. On the one hand, Leighton assured that he would cancel extreme punishments like the drawers freezing. On the other hand, stealing a cabbage or something is not a capital crime, but it does indeed disrupt the order significantly. As for Pike, he had directly taken over the first-class cabin, the compartment where the lawyer couple lived. People from the tail carriages were wildly frolicking in here. On the contrary, LJ was driven out of her home, but due to her previous crimes, she was despised by other passengers. Now, she ended up in the third-class carriage. The control room at the front of the Snowpiercer might be the only place still maintaining order. Melanie, having shed her train chief identity, now dressed in casual clothes, just acted as an engineer involved in the operation of the train. The train's arrival in Chicago also has significant meaning for Melanie. That afternoon, she took the time to go to the night car alone. After the revolution, everyone was busy playing in the front carriages, and the night car was no longer visited. The bodies were left unattended. Melanie came to see Miss Audrey for psychological therapy. 7 years ago, when the Snowpiercer set off, Melanie overly focused on her work and neglected her daughter. Her daughter failed to get on the Snowpiercer that day, and she lost her forever. Under Miss Audrey's guidance, Melanie delved into the deepest part of her heart. She saw her daughter. When Melanie knew that her daughter had missed the train, Melanie resolutely chose the train. This was her greatest regret and pain. With Miss Audrey's counseling, Melanie confronted her pain, expressed her memories of her daughter, and now she can fully focus on her work again. During Melanie's therapy session, the two engineers responsible for the front-end operation received an odd broadcast signal. All aspects hinted that it was coming from the outside. The engineers believed that it was impossible for there to be survivors outside and intentionally hid the news from Melanie. But the contrarian engineer reported it instantly. Melanie called Leighton to make a decision immediately. If there truly were survivors outside, the train should slow down to welcome them. Moreover, looking at the current situation of the train, speeding up would consume too much energy. The train's radio was broken, so they couldn't communicate with the unknown signal in advance. After weighing the options, Leighton agreed to slow down to receive the unknown signal. The answer to the unknown signal was revealed soon. It was a supply vehicle with a Wilford's W mark. The supply vehicle was running rapidly on another track next to the Snowpiercer, looking like it was about to connect with the tail of the train. It turned out that this supply vehicle was left in Chicago when they set off 7 years ago, kind of an experiment. Just then, a bad thought popped up in Melanie's mind. Could it be that Mr. Wilford didn't die and was in the supply vehicle? People from the other carriages also saw the rapidly approaching supply vehicle. Ruth believed that it was Mr. Wilford. The supply vehicle was gaining speed, and the Snowpiercer couldn't outrun it. The supply vehicle connected with the tail of the train. As Mr. Wilford's #1 fan, Ruth was eager to welcome him. She hoped that letting Mr. Wilford take over the train would be the best way to restore order. She immediately put on her fur coat, gathered the choir children, and headed for the tail of the train. Melanie, who had originally driven off Wilford, was the person least hoping for his return. Although it was uncertain whether Mr. Wilford was on the supply vehicle, blocking anyone from the supply vehicle was definitely the safest method. Leighton and Melanie reached an agreement, stating they would mobilize the revolutionaries to guard the tail of the train. Then, Melanie and the engineer put on protective suits, prepared to attack from outside, and tried to disconnect the supply vehicle before it opened the tailgate. During the preparations, the engineer started persuading Melanie to consider negotiating with the supply vehicle. Melanie then learned that the engineer had known all along that the broadcast signal came from the supply vehicle. The parts of the Snowpiercer were damaging at an accelerated rate, and getting the parts from the supply vehicle was an urgent priority. So he intentionally cut off the radio, leading to the decision to slow down and meet. Melanie was unhappy with the engineer's unilateral decision. At the same time, she also felt that after 7 years, the supply vehicle might not have the supplies they needed. Melanie cut through the engineer's protective suit and resolutely climbed out of the train alone. Unknown visitors at the tail were slowly welding open the metal sheet. The revolutionaries and Ruth's choir converged. Leighton judged that the visitors were not friendly. To keep the children away from the tail carriage, he agreed to let Ruth welcome the visitors. Just as the tail was opened, the Snowpiercer, under the operation of the engineer, successfully braked. But the inertia of stopping threw Melanie into the snow. She struggled to stand up and took step after step towards the supply vehicle. The W symbol representing Mr. Wilford's name was rotated and suddenly turned into an M. A girl slowly walked from the supply vehicle. She was clearly not Mr. Wilford. She said Wilford had already taken control and gave them 13 minutes to surrender or freeze to death. It seems that the supply vehicle is indeed being controlled by Mr. Wilford. After the girl declared her stance, she looked around and immediately asked where Melanie was. The girl is Melanie's daughter who missed the train. At this moment, Melanie was getting closer to the supply vehicle, unaware that her daughter was on it. Her eyes were filled with the determination to disconnect it and get rid of any unpredictable risks. And here ends Season 1 of this drama. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.